welcome on behalf of SACSIS, the South African Civil Society Information Service, and FES, the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung South Africa office, to this afternoon panel discussion where we will be discussing a very important aspect of South Africa's electricity crisis, which is that renewable energy is an important solution to our current energy crisis that is being overlooked by our government, which is acting quite recklessly. But the bigger problem that we face than a government that's acting recklessly is the fact that the South African public is not holding our government to account for its reckless behavior. In the face of extremely compelling evidence against nuclear energy and coal as a source of energy, our government is continuing to build 2 coal-fired power stations and investing in an extremely expensive nuclear power plant. Now, there's very persuasive arguments against coal as a source of energy. Coal as energy is the leading cause of global warming, which is leading to, in some parts of the world, extreme droughts, and in other parts of the world, rising water levels. And this is putting pressure on the amount of habitable land that is available to people. Now, one of the most immediate negative outcomes of this is that we are now living in a time where we are witnessing climate wars. The Guardian newspaper actually reports that a total of 46 nations and 2.7 billion people are now at high risk of being overwhelmed by armed conflict and war because of climate change. So global warming, which is predominantly caused by coal as a source of energy, has very deadly consequences for people. But coal provides upwards of 90% of South Africa's energy. And as a nation, we are the 13th highest emitter of carbon dioxide in the world. And there's just absolutely no public debate about it. And it's an extremely worrying situation to be in. This energy crisis that we currently face provides us as a nation with a wonderful opportunity to be taking a step back, knowing what the dangers of climate change are. We should be having a debate about how we can do things differently. We should be asking, how can we be generating energy in this country in ways that are safer, cleaner, and more sustainable? But that debate is just not taking place in the public. If you switch on the radio, if you read the newspapers, what you'll see is that the South African public is extremely concerned about the delays in the build of our 2 coal-fired power stations. There's extreme concern that Medupi and Kusile are taking so long to get completed because people are extremely fed up of load shedding. Now, it's an extremely selfish position that we're adopting as a nation. And our government's response to the climate crisis is that it is now switching to gas and nuclear as cleaner sources of energy. For me, that is a false solution. When we frack for gas, it puts pressure on our very precious water resources, and we know that nuclear energy is extremely dangerous. Nuclear energy produces radioactive waste, which causes cancer, as well as genetic mutations. The public all over the world, in many other parts of the world, is extremely aware of this, and they've turned away from nuclear energy as a source of energy. And particularly in the aftermath of the Fukushima disaster in Japan, we saw people all over the world come out and protest against nuclear power plants. And we're going to hear from Renata as well, how the German public took to the streets en masse, and their government listened to them. When the German public said it's time to shut down these nuclear power plants, the government responded by saying that they would be decommissioning those nuclear power plants. So public opinion and public will is an extremely important thing for us to be focusing on. And that's what we're going to be talking about this afternoon. How can we, as climate activists, as well as people who are advocates for renewable energy, how can we influence public opinion such that the South African public now starts to demand safer solutions and renewable energy? And to help us answer that question and to focus particularly on why the South African public is so indifferent to renewable energy as a solution to our current crisis, I've got a wonderful panel of experts with me this afternoon. Immediately to my right here, I've got Tasneem Essop from the World Wildlife Fund. She is a low-carbon advocate and a commissioner on South Africa's National Planning Commission. So she'll also be able to give us a little bit of an insight into the official position in South Africa. We have Ferial Adam, who heads up the Africa and Arab region team at the environmental NGO 350.org. We also have with us David Figg, who is an environmental sociologist, and he's written a book about nuclear energy in South Africa. And our final speaker this afternoon is my co-host, Renata Tenbush. She's the head of FES. She normally does the welcoming address, opening remarks, but I've put her on the panel today. And she's going to be talking to us about exactly what I mentioned earlier, which is how German public opinion influenced their government's decision. So without further ado, let me hand over to Tasneem, who will talk to us as a planning commissioner and as well as a low-carbon advocate.
Thanks. I will try to do justice to both those hats that I bear in this country. Thanks, Fazila, and thanks for setting the broader context for this discussion. I think it's an important discussion to be having at this point in time. But before I get into dealing with the question at hand, I thought I might present a bit of the global context so that we don't completely depress ourselves. I just heard today that climate change depression is a real condition, apparently. So I don't want us to be completely depressed about things. So in the global context, there are trends emerging that should give us some hope. And I'd like to share some of those trends. While we might not be seeing the impacts directly in South Africa, or we might not be engaged in understanding those global trends, it was interesting that a Bloomberg analysis actually recently said that the race for renewable energy globally has passed its tipping point. In other words, the renewable energy race against fossil fuels has taken a turning point globally. That's a very interesting trend, and they're also predicting that that increasing capacity of renewable energy will continue. It's past the fossil fuel capacity by a few gigawatts. So in 2013, there was 143 gigawatts capacity of renewable energy versus 141 gigawatts of fossil fuel capacity. 2013. They're predicting that, in fact, by 2030, 4 times more of that capacity will be built. And we also have witnessed the price of wind and solar plummet, and so it's becoming more competitive. On the other front, my dearest comrade Ferial will talk about the growing global divestment campaign. So while in the energy markets, we're seeing a turning point for renewables, competing quite strongly with fossil fuels, in the civil society space, or in the space of citizens, in the space that citizens are engaged in, there's a very exciting growing movement called the global divestment movement that Ferial, I'm sure, will be talking about. And that divestment movement linked to a growing overall climate movement. And we've seen those developments happening across the world, more and more people being mobilized, asking the governments to take urgent action or divesting from fossil fuels. That is an important and exciting trend globally. We do know that there are 2 big key events happening in the course of this year. The Sustainable Development Goals Summit that's happening in September. Energy is one of those goals on that agenda, and it's important, many people are engaged in those processes. And then, of course, we have the big UNFCCC COP happening at the end of the year in Paris. That's my day job. I actually lead the WWF climate team, the global climate team, in these processes, probably why one might get depression, climate change depression. But certainly, that's a key moment as well. And as we can see, around these big global moments, you also get momentum. So there's been some political momentum. Governments are suddenly waking up. Obama is suddenly traipsing across the world, meeting with all the emerging economies, talking about climate action. We have the basics up and down, talking about bilaterals on climate action, and very much so putting renewable energy front and center of those climate actions. So there's certainly opportunity for momentum, and not just on the, in terms of government actions, but certainly in terms of what civil society is doing in this space. And it's as I said earlier, it's a growing movement. And then finally, and I'm not covering all the global trends, but just to end off with, I'm sure you are following the trends related to coal, particularly, and the fact that there are more and more of the formal financial institutions who have signaled that they will no longer invest in coal. We're seeing those trends happening globally. So why are we not seeing that kind of positive momentum, not highly positive, but certainly a trend that could be positive and hopeful, reflect itself back home? So let me turn to the domestic context. I mean, I think that we all know that South Africa, and Fazila's laid the context for that, has a long history of what we call the control of the minerals and energy complex in this country. And unfortunately, I would like to contend that with our democracy in 1994, we have not seen the end of the entrenched vested interests of the minerals and energy complex in this country. And neither have we engaged in relation to how we would restructure our economy in a way that takes us away from the dependence on minerals and an energy-intensive economy. We've not done that as South Africa. So I would say that the context in which we're finding ourselves now in terms of the choices we have for energy options have very much been within that, the parameters of that mineral and energy complex, including its past vested interests and its existing vested interests. The one thing that I'm certain about is that a crisis is one of the best ways to catalyze short-termism. And that is the biggest risk we face right now. So what we have is a reaction, as you said, even by the public, that we want an immediate solution. We don't care how we're going to get a solution, we just want load shedding to stop. So that crisis, unfortunately, takes us into a very dangerous path of making very, short-term decisions for quick fixes. And my understanding is that, unfortunately, those quick fixes in the minds of the government is going to be gas. Continue with coal, it will take a bit longer, but gas is what they're going to be focusing on. And then, of course, David will talk about all the exciting plans around nuclear. So there's a bit of movement, of course, on the renewable energy front, and we have to admit that the government has done, quite a bit in relation to the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producers Program, with bid 4 coming up as well. But it's not at scale and not at the levels at which it could have been if we didn't direct our funding into these, as you call it, false solutions. Fracking will take immense funding, and we can't even talk about nuclear. Maybe a bit of insight into the National Planning Commission, because I suppose that's something I could share some insights into. The National Planning Commission, the plan itself, does talk about energy and energy options. It talks about renewables. It takes a very precautionary approach to nuclear, and in fact it called for a serious cost-benefit analysis before procurement goes out. But it does go on to talk about gas as a potential game changer, I confess. Very contested discussions in the National Planning Commission around this. And you will find somewhat, the kind of contradictions between a chapter that deals with a transition to a low-carbon economy in relation to the chapter on energy. There are contradictions because, we promote coal, investment in coal infrastructure, rail for coal, et cetera, in one part of the plan, and then on the other hand, we're talking about ensuring that South Africa fulfills its Copenhagen commitments on climate, and that we actually do have a just transition away from fossil fuels and into a low carbon future. So the plan itself does have contradictory elements, and I think given the kinds of trends that I've just spoken about earlier, this plan was adopted in 2011, and since then the global trends have indicated that there's really no future for coal. That understanding was not prevalent at the time the plan was drafted. So hopefully this current term of the Commission comes to an end at the end of this month. The new Commission will take up these issues again and actually just look at what the current trends are, and that a coal future is actually a meaningless future in the country. So why are the public not interested or indifferent? I would like to argue, and I'm sure again that Friedrich, I hope, will be able to tell you all the good stories about mobilized society in South Africa. Yes, they might not be nationwide, they might not be, this conversation's not happening every day, etc. But I don't think we should underestimate the fact that there has always been a movement. It's not been a renewable energy movement or climate change movement or necessarily an environmental movement per se. But when people fight for basic services in this country, when they mobilized for health reasons against plants in Durban or wherever, those are struggles that have to be acknowledged as part of the overall climate struggle. And recently, I know that there's been a good action against coal, the French-funded coal plants in South Africa. So there's momentum. The challenge for us is, and this is a challenge to us as, I'm not sure everybody in the audience, if everyone's in a climate movement or your daily work is related to climate change, but anybody in the environmental sector in South Africa, I would argue, has a responsibility to make this top of the agenda. I'm going to make one very contentious comment right now, and it's been something I've observed since I've been involved in the environmental sector in South Africa. The biggest challenge in South Africa is that climate change, and hence renewable energy within that, is seen to be an environmental issue. Not an economic issue, necessarily not a social issue, an environmental issue, more broadly. And very specifically in this country, we have still a huge challenge about a movement, an environmental movement, or environmental issues being very much seen as a white middle class issue. So our challenge is going to have to be to build broader movements of people and connect their daily struggles, their struggles in Soweto around electricity, to the struggles against climate change and for renewable energy. If we keep on keeping this at the level of an environmental issue, it's not going to gain any traction or credibility or legitimacy when we're trying to build a broader movement in the country. So this is the responsibility of all of us. WWF, 350, other organized SACSIS, of course, you play a role. All the organizations who are dealing with climate change and renewable energy in this country have a duty to actually start building wider and wider movements, connecting people's realities to something called climate change that everybody probably thinks is only going to happen after we're all dead at the end of the century. We've not succeeded, even though we have hosted a COP, and then, the attention was there. COPs do that. And then it died down. So for me, I don't think there is an entirely indifferent public opinion. I think there is public opinion in the country. It is probably limited in its outreach, but there are wonderful signs of a growing movement, and we will leave that to the Earth Life Africas and 350. WWF isn't a very, we're not a grassroots. Let me just say that. We don't mobilize grassroots, but we certainly do form part of a wider climate movement. We do advocacy work, et cetera, et cetera. But it is going to take hard work in this country to get the nation speaking and the nation engaged. And we can't leave that up to government. It's not going to be government that's going to do that for us. They will not do that for us. It is our duty to make sure that public opinion is not indifferent to the issue of renewable energy, to the issue of climate change, and overall, more broadly, the issues of environmental degradation. I'm going to end it there on that note.
Thank you very much. And thanks for highlighting that it's broader than just an environmental issue. I hope that when we start unpacking in the discussion session, that we look at it more also from the perspective of the energy economy, because I think then we might be able to touch on an issue that the public cares about if we talk about the economy. Fazila, over to you.
Thank you. When I was thinking about this particular talk, and it's called "Why is Public Opinion Unresponsive to Renewable Energy?" and there was this part of me that's first thinking about, there's a sense of disempowerment that I get on there's this dual feeling that I have with society in general. One is one of disempowerment, where people talk about, oh my word, there's e-tolls again, and the corruption, and the traffic lights aren't working, and there's load shedding, but there's no action at all. And then there's another element of it, of very aware, citizenry, where service delivery, for example, if you do not give me lights and if you do not give me water, I will protest. And there's this divide, and it's exactly what Tisneem was saying, was firstly we're living with these silos of struggles, and we're also living with a class division of struggles, and that's problematic. But having said that, I do think that there is a problem with renewable energy in that, as individuals, it is expensive to solarize your house. Let's be honest. So it's not accessible for ordinary citizens. But what we need to look at is change that system and change the manner in which it's being rolled out. So for me to understand the reluctance to embrace renewable energy, we need to understand the context of this industry. The push, as Tisneem has mentioned, for renewable energy came out of the struggle for climate justice and climate change. But for a long time, and all climate activists have to be honest about this, it was about climate change at a scientific level, very, very far removed from people on the ground. When people on the ground were the ones who were experiencing the direct impacts of climate change, that linkage wasn't there, and that's part of the problem. In terms of the vast majority, I just want to add this, is that climate scientists now agree, after heaven knows how long, that to stop catastrophic global warming, we have to keep at least 80% of our fossil fuels in the ground. That's a lot. And we cannot keep mining. Just to let you know, South Africa plans like 24 new mines in the Waterberg region alone, and coal mining. The common education and circular information that you get from fossil fuel industry and from this government is that fossil fuels is cheap and we need it for development. This narrative has been the hegemonic belief of the South African and global society, because it has been backed by the politically and financially powerful industries whom have interest in fossil fuels. And that is for me the first blockage of renewable energy in this country, is the power of the fossil fuel industry. And Tisneem has covered on the mineral energy complex, so I'm not going to go into that. But over the past decade, fossil fuel industries have been lobbying to protect their interests by emphasizing their narrative, which is the use of fossil fuels. In fact, there was a comment by one of the CEOs, I think it was Exaro, that said that it's fossil fuels that will actually help Africa to develop, when actually, if you look at it, it has caused our misery. A very recent example of this kind of lobbying is I don't know if people followed this, but it was in the Sunday Times. And the Department of Energy, the minister gave her budget speech last week, and then they had a departmental party. I have to say this slowly. They had a party that was funded by independent power producers. They drank bottles of champagne that cost 1,550 Rand each. When she was asked about this, she said, her response was that the whole event shows the whole industry is united in support of the government. And she said, I cannot tell the private sector I'm not interested. Now you have the renewable energy sector fighting against that. Now let me just say, the news report was independent power producers. Independent power producers produce renewable energy as well as coal, as well as oil, gas. So there's different. It's just anyone outside of Eskom. So it could have been in that circle of friends, you had renewable energy people. But what I'm saying here is that if we don't change the way we're doing business, if we don't change the system, then what we're going to do is replace the present economic system of having very rich, having poor, having devastation with coal and replacing it with renewable. And that is where we're going to make a mistake. We need to be very cautious about how we roll out renewable energy. So this then brings me into the second blockage, which I think is of importance, and we cannot run away from it, is that because government is so close to the mining sector, so close to people in the fossil fuel industry, that the policies there of renewable energy then influence it. So for example, the South African government will have you believe that they are 100% behind renewable energy, that they really support it. That's the way we're going to go. They have a renewable energy policy, and it talks about 10,000 gigawatt hours, and I think Richard can correct me if it still stands. They talk about the IRP, and that shows that 42% of renewable energy and 38% of coal and nuclear will be achieved by 2030. What they don't say is the actual amount of renewable energy that will be supplied is 8%. And we'll still be dominated by coal and nuclear. And every time I say nuclear, I want to fall off my chair. I was an anti-nuclear activist, and I can tell you we cannot afford it. And if a country comes to you and say, we will back it, as the Russians are doing, and it's called a BOO model, which is build, operate, own, you need to ask why. With something so dangerous, a country, and so expensive that a country would want to do that. People need to rise up to that. Also, in terms of climate change, South Africa believes it has more progressive position than many other countries in international climate negotiations. They made big announcements. They talk about greenhouse gas emissions reductions and targets. But recently, in fact this year, the recent exemptions by the Department of Environmental Affairs of SACSIS, Eskom, and other major polluters say that they say one thing, but then they're doing something totally different. So how do you work this? Some of the other policies that have affected renewable energy, and I think having someone from the renewable energy sector is important, because the initial plan was to have something called refit, which would allow you to feed into the grid. Eskom's claim was that our grid is not strong enough to feed into the grid, but it is being fed into the grid, so I don't understand that argument. They then had this whole thing where you had to bid. To bid to have a renewable energy project, you needed at least R1 million in the bank as a guarantee to put your bid in. So it excludes, it becomes very, very, very exclusive in the way they're rolling out renewable energy, where everybody should be able to just put this out. Just to say, in terms of that, if you put a solar panel on your house and you don't register it, that's illegal. And then when you do register it, you pay much more. Also, let's not move away from the fact that part of the blockage and part of the reason why we're so stuck on coal is of the subsidies. Fossil fuel companies are benefiting from global subsidies. And globally, the subsidies alone account to $5.3 trillion a year. That's equivalent to $10 million a minute every day. This report sounds like crazy figures. It comes from the IMF, the one body you wouldn't think would say this. So that's where this report's coming from. And in South Africa, added to those subsidies, we have other kinds of subsidies, for example, water. So Eskom has been given strategic water use title. So they're a strategic water user. So they get as much water as they need to keep those power stations running. And it's not true that dry cooling doesn't have water, they use water as well. In fact, Eskom uses 1.5% of the country's total water consumption. How much they pay for that, it's minimal compared to what you would think would need to be paid for in terms of that. So there's those kind of subsidies, there's the policies, and then of course there's a lot of the myths. We talk about climate change. The reality is that in this country, because the fossil fuel industry propaganda is so strong, we still have a lot of climate denialists. And part of that is the constant kind of, well, renewable energy cannot meet our baseload demand, cannot meet our development. We're mining for development. The cost of renewable energy is too high. And these things are constantly being disproven all the time, that we don't need any of that. So So the arguments then are falling away, and the one that they're holding on to now is development and job creation, when we know that that's what government does every time they need to do those things. You have those two big kind of blockages for me in terms of renewable energy, and then you have a citizenry where you think, okay, but why aren't we all just going out and debating these issues and putting it? I think with load shedding, people have been debating it. What's concerning is that people could easier buy diesel generators than put solar power on their houses. And that's as long as government has these controls on that industry has no subsidies, as you would see with coal. It blocks access for ordinary people. And also to say that the renewable energy industry is not like, we mustn't look at them with rosy tinted glasses. We must always be vigilant. And good examples of this is in Kenya. When they wanted to build wind turbines, they just moved thousands of people off their land. We cannot have that. It's not right. When you had the solar water heater geysers roll out in South Africa, that is an absolute mess. Government should account for that. And it's just allowed to happen with a lot of corruption. I mean, you've got solar water heater geysers facing south and east and west in the same community. And you think, who did this? And there's no one to, so it creates this system that solar water heater geysers don't work because it's badly managed. So we need to be honest about that as well. The other issue for me is that for bringing it to people, and why are people not doing it? I think also climate change, the depression person. Climate change is just such a big problem. How do you've got so much, and then you've got this climate change thing hanging over you. Renewable energy is too expensive and not accessible. And when people have no lights for 4 hours, it's as if the world has ended. And so when Eskom says we're buying nuclear, no one wants to hear anything else because they don't want to lose their electricity for 4 hours. And that's the kind of society we're dealing with. But having said that, with climate change, it might seem like a big problem, but there's a lot of good happening on the ground. There are organizations here doing amazing things about renewable energy. Narisha is here, she must talk about her project. But the key thing for us is that if we don't make those right choices now, then we are doomed. If we allow government to build more coal-fired power stations and to build this nuclear power station, which, by the way, if you saw on Sunday, is now not one power station at Taspent. It's 3 power stations and more later. If we allow that, we block out everything that we can get with renewable energy, because then I think we'll have more electricity than we'll ever need. Why government's not listening even to the Planning Commission, I don't know. So in terms of cost, you know, if we build renewable energy at much bigger scale than just one house, all of that, we've been finding that the cost of electricity, and if you look at what's been happening, the disaster with Medupi and Kusile, the cost of solar has been dropping consistently. The solar voltaic tariffs decreased by 68%, and wind dropped by 42%. In fact, wind is now 56 cents per kilowatt hour compared to what you would get at Medupi. In fact, and then the jobs mantra, I think we'll cover that in question time. But we always talk about good examples, and everyone talks about Germany. And then when you tell people in South Africa about Germany, well, that's a developed country, they had all the infrastructure, blah, blah, blah. I want to talk about Bangladesh. Bangladesh is a poor, densely populated country with about 162 million people. In 2002, only about 30% of them had access to electricity, which loomed as a major constraint to economic growth and quality of life. And for this reason, the government of Bangladesh established a goal of providing electricity to its entire population by 2020. The program that they had in place basically said they will not achieve that. It would take 35 years to get there. And what they've done is they've moved to renewable energy. And in a short space of time, as of June 2009, more than 600,000 new consumers have been connected to the grid for the first time. And access to electricity increased from about 30% in 2002 to about 40%. At the same time, 320,000 consumers had new solar home systems, surpassing the original target of 50,000. So in the past 10 years, the number of solar systems in Bangladesh has jumped from 25,000 to 2.8 million. That in turn has created some 114,000 jobs. Now this is a real example. This is Bangladesh. Why can't we do it? And I think while we need a vocal citizenry, we need to move away from our silos in terms of our struggles and bring it together because it's about society. Government has a role to play this, and they keep making the wrong decision. We need to be louder about our objection to their wrong decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ferial. And thank you for raising the example of the developing nation that's embraced renewable energy. I mean, I think that's very important for us to hear here in South Africa. David?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to talk a bit about, start off talking about the crisis. And I'm going to say that the electricity crisis in South Africa is a managerial crisis. I don't think demand for electricity has ever really exceeded installed capacity. The amount theoretically available if all sources are functioning properly. Therefore, the crisis arises from how our electricity resources have been managed. The issues are around encouraging lower demand, not higher, and this is in conflict with a utility like Eskom and with municipalities that want to sell more electricity, not less. Managerial failures have also been manifested around a decent timetable for maintenance. They have not been able to stop demand eating into the safety margin. Our solution is to bring new electricity sources on grid as fast as possible. And this points to the fact that we should therefore be more reliant on renewables, because unquestioningly, renewables are the fastest way to install new capacity. We are seeing huge cost and time overruns on the contract to build Medupi, and the same pattern will apply to the nuclear installations. The industry claims that it takes about 10 years to build a nuclear power station, but with overruns it could be considerably longer. So why do South Africans embrace more coal, more nuclear, and wanting to exploit new fossil fuel resources like shale gas? Part of the answer to this, and people have pointed to it, is what the late Jamaican sociologist Stuart Hall termed a moral panic. This is a kind of panic engendered and manufactured by the media or a particular interest group, usually wanting to push forward an unscientific or an irrational position. Our moral panic is around how we can combat what is euphemistically called load shedding, and we're all buying into the language. We should be calling it what it is, which is power outages. And to return us to a 24-hour electricity provision. Eskom government and media do not interrogate the means for delivering more energy. Whichever source they will deliver, they argue, bring it on. The people are so panicked that they mostly go along with this. As I've said, the most rapid form of developing new generation is the multiplication of renewable energy solutions. So why is the public not pushing for this? Well, depending on our definition of public, we need to say that those sections of the public concerned with energy and ecological justice have certainly been advocating renewable solutions very strongly. For example, we have seen the active advocacy by NUMSA, the Metal Workers Union, the biggest trade union in the country, of renewable energy. They question the state's model of introduction of renewables by giving contracts to the most experienced global players rather than keeping production local and socially owned. But sadly, most of civil society are not yet on the same page as NUMSA. Recently, the ANC and allied forces in Soweto staged a march to the Eskom office in Diepkloof, demanding an end to electricity outages and calling for free electricity for Soweto residents. In this instance, the means of delivery, the sources of electricity were not questioned. Early experiments in mass provision of renewables had patchy results because some township residents with solar panels felt that only a few of their domestic appliances could be provisioned. They queried why they were being subjected to a technology that did not provision all of their needs, unlike what was being delivered to more affluent consumers. Price was much more of an issue in years gone by, but as we've heard, more recently, wind power has come to be cheaper than that of coal, and the curve for solar costs is descending very rapidly. Therefore, in the context of rapidly escalating electricity prices, surely it makes more sense to adopt more renewables. The dividend in terms of climate change is also crucial. Clearly, renewables trump coal and nuclear in this regard, as people have shown. The nuclear industry is still in denial that their technology supports harmful climate change. They argue that nuclear reactors produce no CO2. And of course, this is correct. But what we argue is that if you measure the emissions from cradle to grave, the picture gets murkier. There are huge emissions in processes like mining, milling, transport, conversion and enrichment of uranium, and the fuel that goes into the uranium, the fuel that goes into the reactors. Similarly, there are major carbon emissions further down the chain with reprocessing of spent fuel and decommissioning of the reactors, which is like treating them like nuclear waste when their life is over. With renewables, on the other hand, there's almost always a climate benefit. In writing about the rate in South Africa of uptake of renewables, which is accelerating more recently, I call the attitude of government and Eskom a reluctant embrace. We chose not to go the road of early adoption of these technologies, and as a result, we've lost out a lot in terms of domesticating production, training, and bringing down local costs. Why this reluctance? Because renewables raise the possibilities of decentralized energy, of spreading power in both senses out of centralized control, in using the technology to empower many more people on the ground, and of offsetting high bills for by consumers returning unused power to the grid. So these are why renewables are not being embraced. And of course, there was resistance to this by Eskom and government. Now that Eskom has more or less imploded, perhaps we as a society can begin to think of a more creative and more broadly empowering solutions in this area. The crisis should also allow us, as Tasneem was saying, the space to make new arguments and new plans. I firmly believe in the important role of civil society in shaping and effecting just solutions. Can we step up to the challenge, inform the uninformed of the arguments, empower communities and the state to bring about creative solutions? We need to create a whole number of ways in which we demonstrate to the public how the benefits of renewable resources. And for example, WWF earlier this year with AIDC in Cape Town organized a demonstration of the benefits of renewable energy. There are other things that we can use, like science fairs, like school curriculums, like for public demonstrations of renewables, and show model townships or other areas where renewables have already begun to work to people's benefit. We need to demonstrate that this can be done at scale and at cost, time, and ecological benefits much more competitively than with other energy sources. We need to do this as part of our commitment to the eradication of inequality in our own society, and also as part of our global human responsibilities. It's a challenge that we have to embrace. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. And thank you for raising the media, however briefly, but I think they're an important stakeholder that we need to talk about as well. So Renata, over to you. You've got all the answers to our questions.
That would be fine. I will end with a lot of questions that are still pending also in Germany, and I think also these questions would help here the discussion. But let me start with the story first. So you mentioned already, usually I do the introductory remarks as the director of FES, but I'm not an expert on energy and environmental issues, but I'm a political scientist and analyst from my academic background. And as a political analyst, to me, the German Energiewende, which means energy transition, and I absolutely believe this word Energiewende will go into the mainstream of language like Autobahn in kindergarten and these other things, because it was very unique. So it's quite an interesting case. It is a unique example for surprisingly quick political change from a very conservative liberal energy policy towards a progressive, alternative, sustainable political approach, ultimately brought about by a conservative liberal government. At first glance, I think this seems almost as a paradox. If one looks closer, it becomes obvious behind this seemingly sudden and internationally unexpected political shift by the conservative German government in June 2011 stands an enduring social, political, economic, and technical process. The terrible Fukushima incident only triggered this last and important political shift, but this shift was prepared and made possible by a long-standing fight from the bottom, led by a coalition of social movements, including trade unions, supported by a network of academics and think tanks, as well as the Greens, the Social Democratic Party, and the Left Party, which came on board later. Let me tell the story of political power shifts and policy changes as briefly as possible, and later in the debate we can find out whether there are lessons to be learned from it that could help to build up pressure on the South African government to change the current energy trajectory, and also maybe empowers some ideas among society of how to put this pressure on its own government. The story I want to tell is titled Fukushima and its Political and Social Aftermath in Germany, and the analysis itself is based on various presentations, studies and papers supported and published by the Global Energy and Climate Program of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. After the Fukushima catastrophe on the 11th March of 2011 in Japan, caused by an earthquake and followed by a huge tsunami, Germany experienced an earthquake of a political nature, which marked a turning point in the energy policy of the German conservative liberal government. On Monday, 14th March 2011, only 3 days after the disaster in Japan, German Chancellor Angela Merkel announced far-reaching changes to Germany's current energy policy at a press conference. She said, and I quote, "The events in Japan teach us that the risk which we regarded as totally unlikely were not completely so. And if a highly developed country like Japan, with high safety standards and norms, cannot prevent such consequences for nuclear power, then it also has consequences for the whole world, it also has consequences for Europe, and it has consequences for us in Germany." Immediately, a 3-month moratorium was announced, during which the 7 oldest German nuclear power plants would be taken off the grid. Shortly afterwards, an ethics commission on safe energy supply was established, made up of public figures such as former politicians, researchers, and church representatives. The assignment of the commission was to submit a proposal by the end of May in the same year for how a rigorous turnaround in energy policy leading up to the era of renewable energies could be realized. This turnaround by the German conservative liberal coalition government is particularly remarkable given that only 6 months prior to Fukushima, the same government had actually reversed the already existing phase-out nuclear power strategy decided upon by the former SPD Green coalition government in 2000. In 2000, the SPD Green government, in line with their coalition agreement, embarked on a nuclear exit strategy and put into law that all German nuclear power plants had to be taken off the grid, finally after 32 years of running. The so-called Renewable Energy Sources Act, short EEG, from 2000, not only decided on the phasing out of nuclear energy in Germany, but provided for a far-reaching overall energy plan. Thus, the German energy transition was kicked off long before Fukushima. The SPD Green government had carefully but rigorously negotiated the agreement of 2000 with the nuclear power plant operators. However, it was quite obvious they only accepted the deal because, due to the political power relations and the broad support of the German population for the nuclear exit strategy, to negotiate an agreement was the only option they had at that time. Then in 2009, the conservative liberal coalition of CDU and FDP won the national elections. and took over from the SPD Green government. And in September 2010, they introduced a reversed energy strategy. From a perspective of energy policy, there was no need to reverse the SPD Green decision to phase out nuclear power in Germany. At the time, the share of nuclear energy in the German power mix had already fallen from 29.4% in 2000 to 22.5% in 2010. And even more important, within the same period, the use of renewable energies grew from only 6.6% to 16.5%. And I have the numbers from today. They are above 26% for renewable energies now in 2014. The success story of renewable energies, in which the German Renewable Energy Source Act played an instrumental role, demonstrated to people that it is possible and feasible to move away from highly dangerous and climate-damaging means of power production. And it was possible without jeopardizing security of supply, climate protection, and the competitiveness of German industry. The experience that there are viable alternatives to nuclear power and coal, the two main contributors also in the German energy mix, had a crucial impact on the public debate and the overall perception on energy in Germany. In 2009, the Renewable Energy Sources Act was broadly accepted and supported by the German public. Therefore, the decision of the conservative liberal government to reverse the Renewable Energy Act shortly after they took over political power caused a huge public outcry. In particular, because the government, together with the big four utility companies that dominate the energy market in Germany, had drawn up a new agreement that was introduced with a new law in June 2010. The agreement was more or less drafted and signed overnight, and the deal initially was kept under wraps. This gave the public the impression that the four large utilities in Germany, which are privately run but partly owned by public, mainly communal shareholders, had free rein to write their own policy and could shape it to their advantage. The energy giants, the Federation of German Industries and their supporters in the government parties, managed to put huge pressure on the new conservative government. They launched major large-scale pro-nuclear advertising campaigns promoting nuclear energy as most secure and environmentally friendly, we had that before, and the nuclear sector as a provider for jobs. Their aim was to pressurize the conservative government to abolish the agreement they had signed under the Green SPD government on phasing out nuclear energy, and they were successful at that moment. However, German society reacted vehemently, in particular to the concessions granted to the four large utility companies, called the Big Four, and launched a counter-campaign. Tens of thousands of people from all walks of life demonstrated on the streets. The anti-nuclear movement, going back to the 60s, 70s, gained momentum again. Only this time the social opposition was not brought about only by people of the so-called left, but rather it swept up people from all social ranks. Moreover, many small and medium-sized enterprises that had invested in renewable energy expressed their antipathy towards the policy in large advertisements titled, "For win, millions lose." In particular, small and medium-sized energy suppliers like municipal utilities saw themselves as being put at a huge disadvantage by the four big utilities amassing additional profits. The political decision taken in the aftermath of Fukushima, in which major elements of the conservative energy policy from 2010 were finally reversed in one fell swoop, can therefore only be understood against the background of a general and obviously sustainable change in the social climate in German society. This change had started a long way back with the rising of the anti-nuclear and environmental movement in the 60s and 70s, which resulted in the launch of the Green Party in 1980. The formation and the success of the Green Party, that was for the first time elected into government position on the provincial level in 1985 and on the national level in 1998 as a union party in coalition with the Social Democratic Party, allowed for mainstreaming of green policies into politics. The ongoing electoral success of the Green Party pressurized the other parties to take up green policies into their party programs. Thus, the substance of the current Renewable Energy Act that was introduced and finally approved on the 6th of June in 2011, and which supposedly constitutes the so-called Energiewende, is not new in itself, but the actors practicing it are new. For the first time, a conservative liberal government of a major industrial country has decided to phase out nuclear energy, while at the same time continuing to pursue ambitious climate goals. Japan and Switzerland followed. The four main goals of the German Energiewende are a carbon dioxide neutral society and economy in 2050, a complete nuclear phase out by 2022, an increase in renewable energies by 2050 up to 80%, and a similar increase in energy efficiency. For the German society, the events in the aftermath of Fukushima in 2011 opened up a window of opportunity to finally abolish once and for all the nuclear energy path in Germany. After 2011, NGOs have called for a consistent strategy for developing a power supply system by 2050 that is virtually zero carbon and thus without nuclear power, and think tanks and research institutes calculated how such a goal could be realized. And it was strategically and conceptually very well prepared to do so. The conducive socio-political framework that was formed and developed with the formation and further development of the anti-nuclear and environmental movement provided for a broad alliance between civil society, including trade unions and political parties, against nuclear energy. A broad network of different commissions, research institutes, and government advisory bodies had been established, which had conducted well-founded and diverse energy economic analysis and elaborate energy and climate policy options for developing the German power system, while at the same time abandoning coal-fired and nuclear electricity production over the years. The policy of supporting the renewable energy sector development that started with the feed-in tariff law in 1990 and further developed with the renewable energy law in 2000 provided the legislative framework for technical and industrial development in the renewable energy sector. And finally, the economic success story of renewable energies in Germany since 2000, for example, the creation of 380,000 jobs, had changed the mindsets of those who were skeptical towards the demands of the anti-nuclear and environmental movement. Also, external factors that supported the policy shift during the last 30 to 40 years were the EU framework conditions that again were influenced by the oil crisis, which happened in 1973, the Limits to Growth report of the Club of Rome, the Kyoto Protocol process, as well as the Harrisburg and the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. All these events triggered changes in the social and political mindsets towards nuclear energy and a change to renewable energies in Germany. In summary, one can say the ground was very well prepared for the ultimate Energiewende. However, it sadly needed again an external tragedy like the Fukushima catastrophe to finally trigger it. Coming to the end of my story, it needs to be said that the process towards a carbon dioxide, nuclear and coal-free energy supply system is definitely not finalized with the new law in place. The Energiewende was and is a process and not a final solution. Germany is on the right track, but many open questions and controversial issues still need to be resolved. The German energy transition is, despite of the political compromise, definitely not a consensual. Even though great parts of industry are supporting the shift to a low-carbon economy, the power struggle between the supporters, on the one side civil society, parts of politics and industry, and opponents, nuclear power providers and large electricity companies, goes on. So the questions that are still under debate are, for example, questions whether the phase-out plan is fast enough, or the question of replacement of nuclear energy through coal, gas, or renewable energies are not finally resolved. The questions of further promotion of renewable energies through subsidies, the expansion and decentralization of the electricity grid, and the financing of the transformation are still controversially debated. So far, the consumers are paying for the energy transformation via higher electricity fees. The difference between the guaranteed price of government for renewable energy and the actual market price is financed through the so-called EEG-Umlage, which is an allocation of costs, which is under constitutional scrutiny right now. The question of a decentralized and democratically against a rather centralized and privately run system is also under the debate in Germany. Additionally, regional disparities concerning where production of energy will take place, where the main transmission grids will be erected, and thus where industrial development takes place and jobs are created, and who has to carry the burden of having huge electricity transmission pillars, solar energy or wind energy plants in his or her backyard are also under debate. And finally, the big four energy utilities are demanding compensation from the government for the missed profits due to the earlier closing down of the nuclear energy plants than even planned for in the first Renewable Energy Act from 2000. So there's a huge amount maybe also coming for the taxpayers that needs to be paid because the government definitely made some mistakes. However, despite of these entire technical, political and social questions that still have to be resolved, one thing is sure, there is no going back for energy German government behind the political decision to phase out nuclear and follow the path of a sustainable energy in Germany. But the challenge to find a practical way of implementation that balances the social, economic and environmental questions will remain with many governments to come. But I'm sure an informed, robust and democratically, thus participatory debate will provide sustainable answers and keep the pressure up to achieve the energy goals. And last but not least, I'm absolutely 100% being here in South Africa since 1.5 years. I know about the difference on the economic level. I mean, we have a different material basic in our economic and industrial development in the two countries. We have electricity security, obviously, in Germany, and equal access to electricity system. Nevertheless, I mean, the questions that are raised and that are discussed in Germany are not so much different. And how the pressure was put on the government, I think that there are some maybe interesting lessons to learn that could also help here in changing the government's trajectory.